Welcome to a journey back through history where the secrets after Napoleon's fall will be revealed. Get ready because the truth behind France's throne will surprise you. On a damp June evening in 1815, the once unstoppable tide of Napoleon Bonaparte's ambition broke against the mud of Waterloo. Cannon smoke hung over the fields like a heavy curtain, and the Emperor of the French, who had marched across Europe with a will that seemed carved in granite, now faced the bitter taste of irreversible defeat. For years, his enemies had called him a tyrant, a usurper, a scourge upon the continent. But in that moment, stripped of the thunder of victory, he was simply a man cornered by the weight of history. Napoleon had not always planned to linger in Europe after Waterloo. His thoughts turned across the Atlantic to a distant republic that had once inspired him in his youth, the United States of America. The plan whispered among his closest confidants was bold, but not impossible. A fast ship, a discreet departure, and a chance to reinvent himself on foreign soil. He dreamed at least for a fleeting moment of walking free among the avenues of a land where revolutions had succeeded without guillotines, where opportunity stretched as wide as the horizon. But the Allies had learned to fear Napoleon's resourcefulness. The Duke of Wellington himself remarked that Napoleon's presence on any battlefield was worth 40,000 men. Such a man could not be allowed to vanish into exile unguarded. When the emperor attempted to secure passage, his hopes collapsed against the iron blockade of the British Navy. His ships were intercepted, his avenues of escape closed. The ocean itself seemed to conspire against him, a watery wall raised by his enemies. On July 15, 1815, Napoleon surrendered to Captain Frederick Maitland aboard the HMS Bellerophon. He boarded with a mixture of dignity and resignation, dressed not as a fugitive, but as an emperor who still carried within him the aura of command. "I come like Themistocles to throw myself upon the hospitality of the British people," he declared. Yet behind the words, one could almost hear the unspoken recognition he was no longer the arbiter of Europe's fate, but a prisoner at the mercy of his enemies. The British debated what to do with their formidable captive. Some advocated for his execution, others for imprisonment on British soil. But in the end, they chose exile far, far away on a rock in the South Atlantic, so remote that no loyalist army, no daring conspirator, no sympathetic republic could ever reach him. St. Helena, an island 2,000 kilometers from the nearest continent, would be Napoleon's tomb in life. When he departed Europe's shores for the last time, the people watched in silence. Some wept, some cheered, but all felt the weight of an ending. The tricolor once carried across the continent now seemed to fold in upon itself. As the coastline receded, Napoleon, the man who had crowned himself emperor, humbled popes, and restructured the laws of nations, disappeared from view. Yet if his body was confined to that volcanic rock, his legend was anything but. In Paris, whispers began to circulate even before the waves of the Atlantic swallowed him whole. Could he escape? Would he return? Was this another temporary fall before the inevitable resurgence? To the Bourbon monarchs restored to power, the exile was supposed to mark a clean break with a turbulent past. But to the French people, it was the beginning of myth. For Napoleon himself, exile was a cruel theater. On St. Helena, he paced gardens too small for his restless energy, dictated memoirs to loyal followers, and cast his gaze on the endless sea as though daring it to yield him a passage back. His words, written in confinement, traveled farther than any regiment could march. He shaped his own memory, crafting a narrative of destiny betrayed by cowardly kings and perfidious generals, of a man who had always fought for the ideals of the revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity, against the rusting chains of monarchy. There is a strange truth in history: men die, but their stories live on, often growing larger than life. In the taverns of Marseille, sailors swore they had seen secret ships bound for the Atlantic. In the alleys of Paris, children played at being soldiers of the Grande Armée, crying out "Vive l'Empereur," as though his presence still lingered. Even peasants in remote villages spoke of him in hushed tones as if invoking a saint. The Bourbon monarchy, restored in triumph, had scarcely settled into its throne before discovering it had inherited not a loyal nation but one haunted by its former master. Napoleon's absence was not a void, it was a presence of another kind. a shadow stretching across France, filling every gap of discontent, every crack in the legitimacy of the restored kings. As the emperor drifted into the twilight of his life on St. Helena, painting watercolors of landscapes he would never conquer, France itself entered a new era. The people would have to decide whether to embrace their old monarchy, defend the gains of their revolution, or cling to the memory of the man who had embodied both. And so, even as his ship sailed further and further from European shores, Napoleon was not truly gone. His name remained etched in the hearts of millions, his legend simmering beneath the surface of every conversation, every celebration, every quiet act of defiance. He had become more than a ruler. He was now an idea, one that would continue to shape France long after the man himself breathed his last on that lonely island. This then was the paradox of Napoleon's fall. The exile of the man marked the birth of the myth. And myths, unlike men, cannot be exiled. They travel across oceans through generations until even the kings who claim victory over them find themselves living in their shadow. The echoes of cannon fire at Waterloo had barely faded when the victors gathered around the map of Europe, quills in hand, to redraw a continent shattered by decades of revolution and war. To the Allies, France was both prize and problem. A proud nation of nearly 30 million people, rich in culture and ambition, could not be left leaderless or worse, led by the specter of Bonaparte once more. And so the Bourbon monarchy, long exiled and nearly forgotten, was dusted off like an old relic pulled from an attic chest and placed back upon the throne of France. Louis the Weight, brother of the guillotined Louis XVI, became king. He was not a young man, nor a man of overwhelming charisma. He was a survivor, obese, gout-ridden, but politically cautious, a man who had learned to bend without breaking during his years in exile. The Allies, above all, needed a ruler who would not upset the fragile balance established by the Congress of Vienna. Louis fit the bill. But France itself was another matter entirely. The France Louis returned to was not the France his brother had once ruled. This was no longer the kingdom of Versailles, where courtiers bowed and whispered in gilded salons, where the church held unquestioned sway, and where the king's word was law. The revolution of 1789 had torn through those illusions like a storm tearing through a chateau roof. Heads had rolled, privileges had been abolished, and the Napoleonic era had codified many of these changes into law. A new France had been born, a France of civil codes, centralized administration, and men who had risen by merit rather than birth. To attempt to simply rewind history was to invite disaster. Louis knew this. He was shrewd enough to recognize that he could not reimpose the Ancien regime wholesale, but neither was he willing to rule as the mere figurehead the Senate had imagined when they first invited him to the throne. When they presented him with a constitution of their design, one that would bind him tightly to the will of the legislature, Louis balked. He would not be a puppet dangling from revolutionary strings. Instead, he issued his own charter, the Charter of 1814. This document, though similar in many respects to what the Senate had proposed, was framed very differently. It was not presented as a contract negotiated between king and people, but as a royal gift bestowed out of the king's benevolence. It enshrined certain revolutionary gains: equality before the law, religious toleration, freedom of the press. It kept much of Napoleon's administrative machinery intact, but the message was clear. Sovereignty flowed downward from the king, not upward from the people. In this subtle but profound distinction lay the seeds of future discord. The French people, who had fought and bled for the principle of popular sovereignty, were now told their rights were not theirs by nature, but privileges granted by royal favor. The king's hand might extend them. That same hand might just as easily retract them. Still, Louis tried to navigate between two worlds. On the one hand, he maintained much of the Napoleonic bureaucracy. Judges, prefects, and administrators who had proven competent under the empire were left in place. Many of these men had once served Napoleon with loyalty, but Louis pragmatically declared, "Whoever served Bonaparte in the interest of France has served the king." This spirit of forget and forgive allowed the machinery of government to continue functioning. On the other hand, Louis also sought to appease the staunch royalists, the ultras as they were called, who dreamed of restoring France to the glories of the Ancien Regime. These were men and women who had fled during the Revolution, lost their estates, and returned with the bitter memory of guillotines fresh in their minds. They wanted vengeance, and they wanted a France scrubbed clean of revolutionary and Napoleonic taint. In the salons of Paris and the corridors of the restored court, arguments erupted. Could a monarchy survive without acknowledging the revolution? Could a Bourbon reign without embracing at least partially the legacy of Napoleon? The answer was not obvious, and Louis himself often walked a dangerous tightrope. He preserved the Napoleonic Code, which had brought clarity and uniformity to French law. He allowed veterans of the Grande Armée to retain their pensions and honors. He even kept the Legion of Honor, that glittering order of merit founded by Napoleon himself. Yet at the same time, royalist mobs vandalized tricolor flags, tore down busts of the emperor, and sought to erase symbols of revolutionary France. The church, long suppressed under the revolution, returned with a vengeance. Once more, priests wielded influence in schools and pulpits, thundered against the sins of the people. To many liberals, it felt as though the clock was turning backward. To the ultras, it was not enough. They wanted more power, more purity, more revenge. Ordinary French citizens, meanwhile, looked on with mixed emotions. Some longed for stability after 25 years of upheaval. Others resented the sight of immigrants returning from abroad, reclaiming estates and walking the streets as though they had never abandoned France. Still, others clung to the memory of the emperor who had made France feared and respected across the continent. Napoleon might have been on St. Helena, but in Paris cafes his portrait still hung. Soldiers drank toasts to him in secret. Children played at being his marshals. Poets compared his exile to Prometheus bound to his rock. In the collective imagination, he was not a defeated tyrant, but a hero betrayed, a symbol of glory lost. Louis XVIII understood this perhaps better than anyone. His own survival depended on balancing the demands of monarchists with the reality of a people who had not forgotten their revolution or their emperor. He often told his advisors that reconciliation, not revenge, was the only way forward. But reconciliation was easier said than done. The tricolor flag was banned, replaced by the white banner of the Bourbons. Divorce legalized during the Revolution was repealed. Strict censorship muzzled the press. These measures, pushed by ultras and reluctantly accepted by Louis, only fueled resentment. It was as though the monarchy feared the very memories of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Yet beneath the surface, something more profound was happening. France was entering a new kind of struggle, not a battle fought with cannons and cavalry, but one waged in ideas and symbols and in the hearts of its people. Every law passed, every banner raised, every rumor of Napoleon's return became ammunition in the invisible war between past and future. To the king, France was a nation to be tamed, guided back into the gentle arms of monarchy. To many Frenchmen, however, France was something else entirely. A republic denied an empire, betrayed a dream deferred. This was the crossroads at which France now stood. The monarchs of Europe believed they had restored order. In reality, they had only pressed pause on a revolution that still burned hot beneath the surface, and it was only a matter of time before that fire erupted again. Louis XVIII's throne was not carved from oak or marble, but from compromise. Every decision he made was less about ruling with authority and more about walking a tightrope strung precariously between two opposing worlds, the loyalists of the old order and the heirs of Napoleon's empire. He knew that to lean too far to either side was to plunge into chaos. On one side stood the ultras, the ultra-royalists, many of them nobles who had fled France during the Revolution, watching from afar as their chateaux were burned and their privileges dismantled. They returned in 1814 with a hunger not just for restoration, but for retribution. They wanted a France purged of revolutionary ideals and Napoleonic influences. They wanted revenge for the guillotine. In their eyes, the king's charter was already too generous, a betrayal of divine right and a concession to dangerous ideas. On the other side stood the new men of France, the prefects, generals, magistrates, and administrators who had risen to prominence under Napoleon. Many of them were commoners who had achieved positions once reserved for nobles. They carried the efficiency and meritocracy of the empire within them. For these men, Napoleon had given them opportunity, and they were determined not to surrender it. Louis could dismiss them, but he could not replace them. The Bourbon émigrés simply lacked the skills to run a modern state. The king, pragmatic and deeply aware of France's fragility, decided to keep many of these Napoleonic officials in their posts. Marshals who had once led armies across Europe remained honored. Administrators who had streamlined the machinery of government continued their work. And perhaps most importantly, the Napoleonic Code, the emperor's most enduring gift, remained in force. That code was more than a legal document. It was a revolution in ink and parchment. It enshrined equality before the law, ended feudal privileges, and created a system of rights and duties that extended across class boundaries. Farmers knew where they stood in disputes with landlords, merchants knew the laws that governed contracts, and ordinary citizens could appeal to the idea of justice as something written, not arbitrary. By keeping the code, Louis acknowledged a truth even he could not erase. Napoleon had reshaped French society in ways no monarch could simply undo. Louis's public line was one of conciliation. "Forget and forgive," one of his advisors famously declared. The king echoed this sentiment, arguing that those who had served Napoleon had in truth served France. It was a clever way of diffusing accusations of treason while binding the empire's veterans and administrators to his crown. After all, to attack them was to attack the very men who now made France function. But forgiveness had limits. The ultras, bitter and determined, did not forget. They saw former Napoleonic officials walking the streets of Paris with medals pinned to their chests, and their blood boiled. In their eyes, these men were not patriots, but traitors who had once sworn loyalty to the usurper. They grumbled in salons, conspired in private gatherings, and whispered that Louis was too soft, too indulgent of the very forces that had decapitated his brother and enthroned an upstart Corsican. Louis ignored many of these whispers, but he could not silence them. They echoed in the legislature where ultra-royalists pushed to roll back revolutionary laws. Divorce legalized under Napoleon was swiftly repealed. Revolutionary symbols from the tricolor flag to the red Phrygian cap were banned. The white flag of the Bourbons once more fluttered over government buildings, its starkness a deliberate rejection of the tricolor that had marched with the armies of the Revolution and the Empire. These symbolic gestures mattered. To royalists, they represented a victory over the chaos of the past. To liberals and veterans, they were an insult, a reminder that their sacrifices could be erased with the stroke of a pen. The banning of the tricolor in particular stung deeply. For soldiers who had followed Napoleon from the sands of Egypt to the snows of Russia, the flag was not just cloth, it was memory, honor, and identity. Stripping it from public life was like erasing the very years of their lives. Louis saw the danger, but was bound by necessity. If he leaned too far toward the ultras, France risked rebellion from liberals, veterans, and republicans. If he leaned too far toward the liberals, the ultras would accuse him of betraying his bloodline and his god. Thus, his reign became a careful balancing act, a constant oscillation between appeasement and pragmatism. Foreign policy offered no reprieve. The Allies, suspicious of France and wary of any Bonapartist resurgence, demanded guarantees. After Napoleon's 100 Days and final defeat at Waterloo, they stationed occupation troops within French borders. For 3 years, French citizens endured the humiliation of foreign soldiers, marching their streets, quartered in their towns, and draining their resources. The ultras blamed the revolution for this dishonor. Liberals blamed the monarchy's weakness. And through it all, whispers of Napoleon's glory grew louder, not softer. For ordinary people, the contrasts were stark. The revolution had promised liberty. The empire had promised glory. The Restoration promised stability, but too often delivered censorship, repression, and humiliation. Farmers struggled under economic burdens. Merchants complained of stagnation. Urban workers resented the return of priests who lectured them on morality while poverty deepened. It was a France suspended between memories of triumph and the reality of disappointment. The king himself embodied this contradiction. Louis VIII was no tyrant. He understood too well the fate of tyrants in revolutionary France, but neither was he a reformer. He drifted, always seeking equilibrium, yet never fully satisfying either camp. And beneath the careful balancing act, resentment festered. The ultras viewed Louis as too lenient a monarch without backbone. Liberals saw him as a relic, a monarch out of touch with the modern world. To some, he was a necessary placeholder, a man who bought time while France decided its true course. To others, he was the living symbol of compromise, never hated enough to be overthrown, never loved enough to be secure. Yet even as his reign tottered between two worlds, Louis had accomplished something remarkable. Against the odds, he had restored a Bourbon throne to a nation that had guillotined one king and exiled another. He had preserved key elements of Napoleon's legacy while preventing the collapse of the monarchy under ultra pressure. He had navigated foreign occupation and slowly regained sovereignty. For a king who returned to France on the bayonets of foreign armies, this was no small feat. But his legacy was not to endure in peace. For every concession he made, resentment deepened elsewhere. Every compromise sowed seeds of new conflict. France was not reconciled. It was merely contained. And containment, as history would soon show, is never permanent. For beneath the quiet balancing act of Louis XVIII, the deeper struggle remained unresolved. Could France ever truly reconcile monarchy with the revolution? Could a Bourbon sit comfortably on a throne erected upon the ruins of both Versailles and Napoleon's empire? The answer, as the coming years would reveal, was written not in compromise but in upheaval. The Bourbon monarchy had returned, but France was no longer a kingdom of obedient subjects bowing to priests and nobles. It was a nation forged in revolution, hardened in empire, and haunted by its own memories. These shadows, the symbols, the ideas, the ghosts of 1789 and of Napoleon refused to fade no matter how fiercely the Bourbons tried to banish them. The first clash came in the realm of law and custom. One of the earliest acts of the restored monarchy was to repeal divorce. Under Napoleon's civil code, divorce had been legalized, an unprecedented acknowledgement of individual freedom and modern necessity. For countless men and women trapped in broken marriages, it had been a lifeline. Its repeal in 1816 was more than a legal change. It was a signal that the Bourbons were determined to roll back the clock. The church rejoiced, hailing the return of moral order. But among the urban bourgeoisie and educated classes, bitterness simmered. They felt that their lives, their choices were being dictated not by progress, but by priests whispering into royal ears. Symbols became battlegrounds. The tricolor flag, born of the revolution and carried to victory across Europe, was outlawed. In its place, the stark white banner of the Bourbons once again flew from palaces and ministries. But the tricolor was more than cloth. It was memory, pride, and identity. It had been planted on the walls of Vienna, Berlin, and Madrid. Soldiers had died carrying it through the smoke of Austerlitz and Borodino. To strip it away was to tell veterans and citizens alike that their sacrifices meant nothing. And so, in defiance, tricolors reappeared in secret, painted on walls, stitched into ribbons hidden under jackets. To wear it was to resist. The revolution's ideals were also under siege. The ultras, flush with influence in the legislature, dreamed of erasing not only Napoleon's legacy but also the revolution itself. They pushed for laws that exalted the church, restricted the press, and punished dissent. Censorship spread like frost. Newspapers were shuttered, pamphlets seized, and those who dared to write in defense of liberty found themselves silenced or imprisoned. The written word, once the engine of revolution, became contraband in its own birthplace. And yet, repression only deepened the sense of betrayal. Ordinary Frenchmen could not forget the promises of 1789 or the victories of the empire. The revolution had promised liberty and equality. Napoleon had promised glory and order. What did the Bourbons promise? For many, the answer was nothing but submission to the church, to the nobility, to the past. The clergy, restored to influence, grew bolder. Churches, once stripped bare during the revolution, were re-ornamented. Sermons thundered against the sins of the people, warning of divine punishment if France strayed again. Catholicism declared the state religion spread its authority once more through schools and universities. To liberals, this was not a return to faith, but an intrusion of superstition into public life. They mocked the clergy, whispered of hypocrisy, and contrasted the priests' lectures with the grinding poverty in which so many workers still lived. The state, desperate for legitimacy, turned to ritual. In a gesture both pious and political, the Bourbons instituted a national day of mourning for the execution of Louis XVI, the Martyr King. Every January 21st, citizens were expected to bow their heads and atone for the sins of the revolution. But instead of unity, the day bred resentment. For royalists, it was sacred. For liberals, it was provocation. For veterans, it was insult. How could they mourn the death of a king when their loyalty had been to France, to liberty, or to the emperor who had carried them to greatness? Even the language of politics became dangerous. To speak of altering the succession line was defined as a crime. To write in praise of Napoleon was treasonous. To question the monarchy was to invite surveillance and punishment. And yet, behind closed doors in taverns and marketplaces, the forbidden words still spread. Whispers of the emperor's return, of a new uprising of justice yet to come. Louis XVIII tried to steady the ship. He dissolved the ultra-royalist Chamber of Deputies in 1816, recognizing that their zeal only deepened division. He leaned instead on moderates, the so-called doctrinaires, who counseled him to find a middle path between liberty and monarchy. But the damage was already done. The ultras' reactionary measures had given liberals and Republicans new fuel, while their symbols of repression, white flags, mourning days, censorship laws, only sharpened the contrast with Napoleon's memory. Because while the Bourbons banned tricolors, people waved them anyway. While they outlawed revolutionary songs, voices still rose in taverns to sing La Marseillaise. While they mourned Louis XVI, crowds celebrated August 15th, Napoleon's birthday, as though it were a holy day. In these small acts of defiance, the revolution and the empire refused to die. They lived on in memory, in secret, and in hope. And so, France entered a paradoxical twilight. On the surface, a monarchy ruled again, buttressed by the church and conservative law. But in the streets and the imagination of the people, the revolution still pulsed like an ember beneath ash. Napoleon's absence was not absence at all. It was presence of another kind. The haunting presence of a hero turned legend, a ghost that refused to leave. The ultras believed they had won. The king believed he had stabilized his kingdom. But in truth, the Bourbon monarchy stood on fragile foundations. It had tried to bury the revolution under ceremony, censorship, and white flags. But the revolution was not buried. It was waiting. Exile was meant to silence Napoleon. St. Helena was chosen precisely because it was far distant and impossible to escape. Yet the more the Bourbons and their allies tried to banish him to the edge of the world, the more he returned in the minds, the words, and the imaginations of the French people. Napoleon had left behind not just a memory, but a legend. To his enemies, he was a tyrant, a usurper who had trampled Europe beneath his boots. But to ordinary French citizens, farmers, soldiers, artisans, and workers, he had become something far greater, the embodiment of patriotism. A man who rose from obscurity and reshaped destiny with his own hands. In a nation bruised by foreign occupation, crushed by humiliation, and governed by a monarchy that seemed both distant and reactionary, his memory became a banner under which to dream. They celebrated his birthday August 15th in secret. Officially, the day was meant to honor the feast of the Assumption of the Virgin Mary. But across France, villagers raised glasses and whispered toasts to l'Empereur. Priests tried to silence the murmurs, and police reported to Paris about seditious gatherings. Still, the people persisted. For them, the day was not about saints in heaven. It was about the emperor who had once walked among them. Songs spread, carried by wandering musicians and whispered by soldiers in taverns. Old marching tunes of the Grande Armée found new life, their lyrics reshaped into quiet defiance. In marketplaces, women hummed them while selling bread. In workshops, apprentices tapped the rhythm on their benches. It was rebellion, not with muskets, but with memory. Objects too became subversive. Revolutionary rosettes, caps, and banners resurfaced. In some villages, tricolor flags were hoisted onto church towers, a silent challenge to the white banners of the Bourbons. In others, children played with makeshift drums, pretending to be soldiers of Austerlitz. Police reports describe confiscated portraits of Napoleon painted, carved, or crudely sketched, hidden in homes like religious icons. To possess one was to risk suspicion. To display one was to declare defiance. Yes. Even rumors transformed into weapons. Tales circulated of Napoleon's miraculous return. Some claimed he had escaped St. Helena and was gathering forces abroad. Others told of peasants dreaming of him visions where he promised to return and free France from the Bourbons. One story, half joke, half hope, spread quickly. A newborn in southern France cried out "Vive l'Empereur" at birth. Superstition blended with politics, turning legend into prophecy. This was the power of absence. A man confined to a rocky island thousands of miles away was more present in France than the king who sat on the throne in Paris. For while Louis VIII promised stability, Napoleon had given the people something richer: identity. He was theirs, an emperor of merit, a soldier of the revolution, a son of France who had fought for its glory. The Bourbons knew it. They feared it. Their laws outlawed even the mention of Napoleon's name in public. They censored books, confiscated prints, and imprisoned writers who dared praise him. But in doing so, they only deepened the sense of persecution. To speak of Napoleon became an act of rebellion, a way for ordinary men and women to claim power against authority. The forbidden word carried more weight than all the official decrees combined. The contrast between king and emperor was unavoidable. Louis, heavy and cautious, presided over a court that seemed draped in nostalgia and compromise. Napoleon, though absent, was remembered as dynamic, decisive, a man who had marched at the head of armies and shared the hardships of his soldiers. Louis reminded people of submission. Napoleon reminded them of glory. Foreign occupation only sharpened this divide. From 1815 to 1818, Allied troops remained in France, stationed as both punishment and insurance against rebellion. Their presence humiliated the nation. To the French, it was proof that the monarchy owed its existence not to their will, but to foreign bayonets. In this climate, Napoleon's memory became more than nostalgia. It became resistance itself. He was the anti-monarch, the anti-foreigner, the embodiment of a France that had once dictated terms to Europe rather than endured them. This cult of memory was not merely sentimental. It became political dynamite. Liberals, Republicans, and even former Bonapartists found common ground in invoking Napoleon as a symbol of liberty against Bourbon repression. Some praised his administrative reforms, others his military genius, still others his revolutionary roots. Each saw in him what they most longed for. He was not just a man, they had turned him into a mirror reflecting every French grievance and every French hope. The Bourbons had tried to erase him. Instead, they had canonized him. Like a saint banished by Rome only to be venerated in secret chapels, Napoleon became more powerful in absence than he ever had been in power. And so, in the streets of Paris, chants of "Vive l'Empereur" interrupted royal ceremonies. At funerals, veterans' tricolor flags were draped over coffins. At weddings, young men pledged loyalty not only to their brides, but also to the ideals of Napoleon. Everywhere, the ghost of the emperor walked. To the ultras, this was treason. To the monarchy, it was a nightmare. But to the people, it was comfort. For even as the present seemed bleak, occupied, censored, and constrained, the memory of Napoleon promised that France could be more, that it had been more, and that perhaps one day it could be again. France had known defeat before, but never humiliation like this. For centuries, its kings had strutted across Europe as arbiters of power, shaping dynasties, dictating treaties, and spreading French culture like the perfume of Versailles. Napoleon had carried that legacy, further bending crowns to his will, planting the tricolor on foreign capitals. Now, in the aftermath of Waterloo, the roles had reversed. Foreign soldiers marched on French soil not as allies, but as masters. Between 1815 and 1818, France endured occupation by Allied troops. British redcoats, Prussian fusiliers, Austrian grenadiers, and Russian Cossacks bivouacked across the countryside. Some villages saw their fields stripped bare to feed foreign stomachs. In Paris, the sight of foreign uniforms in familiar streets was a wound to national pride. Each passing column of troops was a reminder that France, once feared, was now subdued. The Allies insisted this was a safeguard, a punishment for Napoleon's return during the 100 Days, a guarantee that France would not rise again. But for the French people, it felt like shackles. Taxes swelled to pay for the cost of occupation, grain prices rose, and trade faltered. Families who had already endured decades of upheaval now found themselves hosting soldiers who spoke in strange tongues, prayed to strange gods, and laughed at French misfortune. Taverns filled with bitter murmurs. Farmers cursed the foreign yoke. Children mocked the occupiers in rhymes and darted stones at patrols before disappearing into alleys. Everywhere, resentment simmered. France had lost wars before, but never its dignity like this. The monarchy, restored on the points of foreign bayonets, seemed less a ruler of the French than a client of Europe. In this atmosphere, Napoleon's memory burned brighter still. For if the Bourbons symbolized submission, Napoleon symbolized defiance. Veterans remembered how he had stared down coalitions of kings and humbled them, how the tricolor had once flown over Vienna, Berlin, and Madrid. In their minds, the occupation was a reversal of fortune too bitter to endure. And so they dreamed of the emperor as savior, whether alive on St. Helena or already transformed into myth. Rumors circulated like wildfire. Some claimed Napoleon had escaped his island prison, sailing under disguise to rally armies in Italy or Corsica. Others whispered he would return at the head of a fleet, that he had allies among the very nations now occupying France. Still others spoke of omens, a comet streaking across the sky, a newborn shouting "Vive l'Empereur" at birth. Hope and superstition mingled, weaving fantasies where politics had failed. The Bourbons tried to counter these whispers with ritual and law. They organized national days of mourning for Louis XVI, calling on citizens to repent for the revolution's sins. They banned tricolor cockades and symbols. They censored songs, pamphlets, and newspapers that dared to mention Napoleon's name. But repression only made his legend more potent. To sing a Napoleonic song became a political act. To wear a tricolor ribbon was an act of rebellion. The forbidden was always more powerful than the permitted. Meanwhile, the economic toll of occupation deepened discontent. Towns forced to billet foreign soldiers endured theft, assault, and scarcity. Markets stagnated as taxes funded the armies of France's enemies. Merchants complained of lost trade routes, while artisans watched their businesses wither. For many, the monarchy was indistinguishable from the occupiers. It had returned not by the will of the people, but by the decree of Europe. The resentment sometimes boiled over into violence. Allied patrols were harassed, sometimes attacked. Secret societies of veterans and liberals met in smoky back rooms, whispering of conspiracies and uprisings. Though many of these plots collapsed before they began, the very fact that they existed spoke volumes. France was restless, resentful, and unreconciled. Foreign diplomats in Paris noted the paradox. France obeys, wrote one Prussian observer, but France does not forgive. Even Louis XVIII himself privately admitted the danger. He had regained a throne, but not a nation's heart. The people still looked to Napoleon, whether as a man or as a memory, for the pride the monarchy could not provide. When in 1818 the Allies finally withdrew their troops after 3 years of occupation, France erupted in relief. Church bells rang, crowds cheered, and pamphlets declared it the end of national humiliation. Yet the damage had been done. The Bourbon monarchy had survived only under the shield of foreign arms. Its legitimacy, instead of being strengthened, was tarnished. And in the vacuum left by the departing soldiers, Napoleon's ghost filled the streets once again. For in the cafes of Paris, veterans still clinked glasses to his name. In provincial towns, peasants still whispered of his return. And in every heart that had suffered humiliation, the contrast was clear. The Bourbons had brought submission, but Napoleon, whether in life or legend, had brought glory. The occupation had been intended to crush France's spirit. Instead, it had sharpened the divide, ensuring that the emperor's memory would endure not as a relic, but as a rallying cry. And the next time the streets erupted, it would not be foreign armies that France would fight, it would be itself. The cannons of Waterloo had fallen silent, but France was not at peace. Beneath the polished speeches of restoration and the white flags waving from palaces, the streets seethed. The Bourbon monarchy was back, but the France it ruled was fractured, split into rival camps that despised each other with a venom born of 25 years of blood and revolution. And soon that venom spilled out into violence. Royalists, humiliated by Napoleon's 100 Days, sought vengeance. To them, France had betrayed its true king by flocking to Bonaparte the moment he returned from Elba. They called their neighbors traitors, cursed their colleagues, and eyed even casual acquaintances with suspicion. The ultras, emboldened by their influence in the legislature, urged purges. And in the south of France, these whispers turned to action. Mobs roamed the streets of Avignon, Marseille, Nîmes. Bonapartists, liberals, Republicans, even Protestants, anyone suspected of disloyalty to king and church, were hunted down. Lynchings spread like wildfire. Reports tell of hundreds slain, dragged from homes, beaten in public squares, their bodies left as grim warnings. In some towns, Napoleonic veterans were targeted. In others, Protestants bore the brunt, their faith linked by ultras to Republican heresy. For the Bourbon loyalists, this was not simply vengeance, it was cleansing. The government in Paris condemned the worst excesses, but often looked away. Too many deputies quietly approved of the bloodletting. They told themselves it was justice, a settling of accounts after the years of revolution and empire. But for liberals and moderates, the massacres revealed something darker. The monarchy had not returned as a gentle reconciler, but as the vengeful hand of reaction. Against this fury, resistance formed. In taverns and smoky backrooms, liberals and Republicans plotted. Some dreamed of compromise, a constitutional monarchy that would respect liberty while preserving stability. But others were more radical. They wanted a return to the revolution to 1793 without the guillotine, or even to Napoleon's empire reborn. Secret societies sprouted, often modeled on the Carbonari in Italy. They whispered oaths by candlelight, raised tricolor flags in basements, and dreamed of insurrection. The conspiracies sometimes leapt into action. In Grenoble in 1816, Republicans rose in arms. They called on veterans to join them, promising to finish the work of the revolution. But the rebellion was swiftly crushed, its leaders imprisoned or executed. The next year, Lyon flared with unrest, again beaten down, but not forgotten. Assassinations stalked the land. Prominent Napoleonic generals were murdered by royalist fanatics, their deaths celebrated in ultra newspapers. At the same time, royal officials lived in constant fear of daggers in the dark. Even foreigners felt the heat. In 1818, a failed attempt was made on the life of the Duke of Wellington, Britain's hero of Waterloo, and the man overseeing the Allied occupation. The shot missed, but the message was clear. France was not tamed. It was a civil war in miniature, fought not with armies, but with mobs, pistols, and conspiracies. Each side believed itself the true guardian of France's destiny. To the ultras, it was a crusade to erase the stain of revolution. To the liberals, it was resistance against tyranny disguised as monarchy. To the Bonapartists, it was loyalty to the only man who had ever united France and made her feared. Ordinary citizens were caught in the middle. Farmers who had gained land during the revolution feared its confiscation if the ultras triumphed. Merchants who had prospered under Napoleon's continental system now watched foreign goods flood their markets. Workers promised stability, instead endured uncertainty as politics turned violent. Every street corner, every tavern, every church pew hummed with politics. In France, after Napoleon, neutrality was nearly impossible. The authorities, terrified of conspiracies, tightened control. Surveillance expanded. Suspected liberals and Bonapartists were dragged before tribunals on flimsy evidence. Printing presses were raided, pamphlets seized, editors jailed. Yet the more the monarchy tried to silence dissent, the more it spread underground. France became a nation of whispers where a careless phrase could mark one as a traitor. but silence could also betray sympathy. Even the army was not immune. Officers whispered of conspiracies. Soldiers still loyal to the memory of Napoleon grumbled at the sight of white Bourbon cockades replacing the tricolor. The government knew the danger an army that had once marched across Europe at Napoleon's word might march again even against its own king. And so the years after Waterloo became an age of unease. The throne stood, but it stood in a land aflame with distrust. Every assassination, every riot, every uprising was a crack in its foundation. The poet Chateaubriand himself, a royalist, wrote that France lived in a civil war without battles, a revolution without guillotines. He meant it as warning, but it was also prophecy, for this simmering unrest would not vanish. It would build, deepen, and eventually explode again, reshaping France in ways no Bourbon could control. The Bourbons believed they had restored order, but in truth, they had only painted a thin coat of stability over a country still burning inside. And when the fire erupted, it would consume them. The violence in France was only one tremor in a larger earthquake shaking the continent. From Madrid to Milan, from Berlin to Warsaw, the ideals of liberty and revolution once unleashed in 1789 refused to be caged again. France was the epicenter, but its aftershocks reached everywhere. And for the crowned heads of Europe gathered in Vienna, whispering in palaces, riding in gilded carriages, the threat was terrifying. Secret societies multiplied in the shadows. In taverns and student halls and army barracks and merchant guilds, men swore oaths to liberty and conspired against thrones. Some modeled themselves on the Carbonari of Italy with rituals lit by candle and words whispered like scripture. They carried daggers as symbols of defiance, tricolor ribbons as badges of faith. To the conservative order established at Vienna, they were a plague that could spread across borders faster than any army. France was both their inspiration and their battleground. The Bourbon monarchy, restored by foreign bayonets, became a symbol of what the conspirators despised: monarchy without consent, authority without legitimacy, power without the people. Napoleon's legend only strengthened them. If one man had once defied kings and crowned himself emperor, why not again? If the tricolor had once flown over Europe, could it not return? The monarchs of Europe trembled. To Metternich, the Austrian statesman who had orchestrated the Vienna settlement, liberalism was not a philosophy, it was an infection. He wrote of it as a disease that seeped through borders, corrupting loyalty, rotting obedience, turning subjects into citizens. And France, he feared, was still its most contagious carrier. The Congress of Vienna had not only redrawn maps, it had forged an alliance of paranoia. Austria, Prussia, Russia, and Britain, supposed rivals, now acted in concert to suppress any spark of rebellion. Their alliance was less a brotherhood than a prison guard pact sworn to crush revolutions wherever they appeared. France, newly restored to the Bourbon line, was both their ward and their test. If France could not be contained, all of Europe might burn again. Thus, the Bourbons became partners in repression. Surveillance expanded beyond borders. Letters were opened, travelers questioned, meetings infiltrated. To speak of liberalism in Vienna or Berlin was to invite police interrogation. To publish a pamphlet in Paris was to risk arrest. Censorship spread like fog across the continent, muffling the voice of liberty, but never extinguishing it. Yet repression only deepened resistance. In France, university students whispered of Rousseau and Voltaire, quoting them under their breath between lectures, carefully scrubbed of revolutionary content. Soldiers in garrisons traded stories of Napoleon by firelight, their officers turning blind eyes while sharing the same nostalgia. Merchants gathered in secret clubs debating not only commerce but constitutions. Women, often overlooked by the authorities, became messengers and organizers, carrying letters tucked in hems and tricolors stitched into shawls. The authorities saw conspiracy everywhere, and sometimes they were right. In 1818, police uncovered a network of army officers planning a coup, convinced that the people would rally the moment they rose. Though the plot failed, it sent shockwaves through Paris. If the army itself was not trustworthy, what chance did the monarchy have? Metternich and his allies seized on every rumor, every whisper to justify harsher crackdowns. In their minds, Europe was on the brink of another 1789. The memory of the guillotine haunted them. The image of Napoleon astride his horse tormented their dreams. And so, they doubled down, convinced that only by suffocating liberty could stability survive. But ideas are not so easily suffocated. The more the Bourbons censored, the more the forbidden pamphlets circulated. The more spies infiltrated secret societies, the more those societies multiplied, each split birthing another cell. Repression became proof of tyranny, and tyranny became justification for resistance. France, meanwhile, remained a tinderbox. Royalists clung to their vision of a pious, obedient kingdom. Liberals dreamed of constitutional balance. Bonapartists whispered of empire reborn. And across all factions, resentment festered at the thought of foreign kings dictating French destiny. To a peasant in Provence, the occupying Prussian patrol was insult enough. To a student in Paris, the censorship of books felt like chains on the mind. To a veteran of Austerlitz, the banning of the tricolor was an erasure of honor. Each grievance, small or great, fed the same conclusion: the Bourbons did not represent France, they represented fear. And so Europe watched France, and France watched itself. Each side convinced the other was plotting, conspiring, preparing. The monarchs believed liberals were united in a grand conspiracy across borders. The liberals believed monarchs were united in a grand conspiracy against liberty. Perhaps both were true. What was certain is that beneath the white flags of the Bourbons and the gilded ceilings of Vienna, the revolution still lived, not in parliaments or armies, but in whispers, oaths, and memories. And whispers, though fragile, can topple empires when the time is right. The Bourbons had restored a throne. Europe had restored a map. But neither had restored peace. For peace is not born of repression. It is born of justice. And justice in France still waited in the shadows. On a cold February night in 1820, the shadows of Paris lengthened with whispers of violence. At the entrance of the Paris Opera House, where chandeliers glittered and aristocrats filed in with perfumed grace, history once again slipped its dagger from the sheath. The victim was Charles Ferdinand Duc de Berry, nephew of Louis XVIII, son of the ill-fated Count of Artois, and one of the last hopes of the Bourbon line. In the eyes of royalists, he was not just a prince. He was the vessel through which the dynasty might secure its fragile future. His marriage had promised heirs. His presence had promised continuity. But to his assassin, he was a target that symbolized everything rotten about the Restoration. As the Duke exited the opera that night, a man lunged from the crowd. His name was Louis-Pierre Louvel, a saddler by trade, but more importantly, a Bonapartist consumed with hatred for the Bourbons. With cold precision, Louvel drove his dagger into the Duke's chest. The prince collapsed, blood soaking the cobblestones, his shocked attendants crying out in horror. Within hours, Charles Ferdinand was dead. Paris awoke the next morning to news that shook the monarchy to its core. A royal had been murdered, not by foreign enemies, not by conspirators from abroad, but by a Frenchman in the heart of the capital. For the ultras, it was proof of what they had long claimed: France was infested with Bonapartist traitors, liberals, and revolutionaries conspiring against throne and altar. The assassination ignited a wave of paranoia. In royalist salons, the whispers turned to roars. They spoke of purges, of tightening control, of extinguishing liberty itself. For if a duke could fall at the hands of a common saddler, what safety was there for kings? Louis XVIII grieved the loss of his nephew, but understood its political weight. The ultras surged in power, capitalizing on the shock. They painted the duke as a martyr for monarchy, slain by the poison of revolutionary ideals. And in the wake of grief, their demands hardened into law. The government moved swiftly. Liberals were swept from power, replaced by ultras determined to avenge the murder. Within a year, the Chamber of Deputies had been stacked with their loyalists. Out of 428 seats, all but 17 fell under their control. France, once cautiously balanced between moderates and monarchists, now tilted sharply toward reaction. With power secured, the ultras wasted no time. They tightened censorship, expanded surveillance, and used the tragedy as justification for their crusade against dissent. Newspapers that dared to question the government were shuttered. political opponents were hounded, accused of complicity in a vast liberal conspiracy. The line between assassination and ideology blurred until all liberals were painted with the assassin's brush. But grief also carried contradiction. The Duc de Berry's death, tragic as it was, paradoxically secured the dynasty's survival. His widow, pregnant at the time of the murder, later gave birth to a son, the so-called miracle child, Henri, Duke of Bordeaux. Royalists hailed him as proof that Providence had not abandoned the Bourbons. Pamphlets declared the newborn the living symbol of divine favor, the embodiment of continuity in the face of violence. Still beneath the surface, the assassination deepened the fractures in French society. To ultras, Louvel's dagger was not the act of one man, but the manifestation of a revolutionary disease infecting the nation. To liberals, the ultras' response was a mask for tyranny, exploiting tragedy to strangle liberty. And to Bonapartists, the murder was complicated. Some whispered admiration for Louvel's daring, others recoiled at his fanaticism. The people of Paris felt the tremor. They saw more soldiers in the streets, more censors at the presses, more spies lurking in taverns. Fear became part of daily life, fear that any careless word might be twisted into evidence of treason. Yet, at the same time, resentment simmered. The Bourbons claimed legitimacy through bloodline and tragedy, but what legitimacy did they offer the shoemaker, the farmer, the veteran? What comfort did a miracle child bring to men still paying taxes for foreign wars, or to women mourning sons lost on battlefields, from Austerlitz to Waterloo? Even abroad, the assassination reverberated. Conservative monarchs across Europe seized on it as proof of their paranoia. If in France, a country supposedly stabilized royal blood could still be spilled, then what of Spain, Italy, or the German states? To them, the dagger at the opera was not aimed at a single duke, but at monarchy itself. And so, repression tightened not just in France, but across the continent. Secret societies were hunted, meetings, banned universities purged of liberal professors. In Austria, Metternich nodded grimly. His warnings had been right. In Prussia, spies reported with renewed zeal. In Russia, censorship grew harsher. The Duc de Berry's murder became the spark for a continent-wide tightening of chains. Yet, repression does not erase memory, it engraves it deeper. The opera steps stained with Bourbon blood became another symbol in the contested theater of French history. To royalists, they marked martyrdom. To liberals, they marked the lengths ultras would go to silence dissent. And to Bonapartists, they whispered of a fight not yet finished. France once again stood at a precipice. The ultras had gained near total control, intoxicated by power and righteous in their certainty. But power gained in grief is fragile for grief. Fades and certainty blinds. In chasing vengeance, the ultras forgot what Louis XVIII had once understood. France could not be ruled by one half against the other. It needed balance. And balance had just been shattered with the thrust of a knife. The flames lit outside the opera that night did not end with the prince's funeral. They spread into laws, into streets, into every heart that saw not stability but oppression reborn. The dagger that killed the Duc de Berry struck deeper than one man. It struck at the fragile illusion that France had finally found peace. In 1823, a French army once more marched across the Pyrenees. But this time, it did not march under Napoleon's eagle, nor for the tricolor flag. It marched for the Bourbons, carrying the white standard of lilies, the banner of kings past. They called themselves Les 100,000 Fils de Saint Louis, the 100,000 sons of Saint Louis, an army cloaked in sacred legitimacy, as though blessed by heaven itself to restore monarchy where liberalism had dared take root. The target was Spain. In Madrid, King Ferdinand VII had been forced by liberal revolutionaries to accept a constitution that shackled his power. To the ultras in Paris, this was intolerable. A Bourbon king in chains was an insult to the entire monarchical order. And to Metternich and the Conservative Alliance of Europe, it was a contagion. If Spain's liberal experiment succeeded, what was to stop France, Italy, or even Germany from following? Louis VIII hesitated, cautious as always, but the ultras pushed hard. The assassination of the Duc de Berry had given them momentum, and now they sought a grand display of Bourbon strength. Intervention in Spain offered both revenge against liberalism and redemption for the monarchy at home. At last, the king yielded. France would march not to conquer but to rescue a brother throne. And so, in the spring of 1823, French troops crossed into Spain. The irony was not lost on the people. Many of the soldiers marching south had once fought under Napoleon, carrying liberty and revolution as banners across the same mountains. Now they marched to suppress liberty, to chain a parliament to uphold absolutism. To some, it felt like betrayal. Yet the ultras framed it as holy duty. Priests blessed regiments before departure, declaring them crusaders for God and King. Newspapers hailed the expedition as France's chance to reclaim honor after the humiliations of occupation. Songs celebrated them as the sons of St. Louis, heirs of a divine legacy stretching back to the medieval Crusades. In truth, the campaign was swift and efficient. The Spanish liberals fought bravely, but they were divided and poorly armed. The French army, disciplined and well-supplied, advanced steadily. At the Battle of Trocadero in August, French forces stormed a key fortress and broke the backbone of resistance. Within weeks, Ferdinand VII was restored as absolute monarch. The mission, as the ultras declared, was a resounding success. Back in Paris, the victory was paraded as proof that divine favor rested once again on the Bourbons. Paintings glorified the storming of Trocadero, speeches hailed the triumph of order over chaos, and the monarchy basked in a glow of propaganda. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the white flag had regained its former luster. But beneath the pomp, cracks widened, because while the ultras celebrated, many French liberals recoiled. They saw their army, once the sword of revolution, reduced to the jailer of liberty. They saw French blood spilled not for glory or defense, but for the defense of tyranny abroad. At the border, liberal demonstrators gathered waving tricolor flags, begging soldiers not to cross, not to betray the ideals of 1789. Some soldiers wept, others marched grimly, knowing their muskets now defended kings against peoples. The intellectual class, too, responded with fury. Poets and writers denounced the campaign as a betrayal of France's true spirit. Pamphlets compared Ferdinand VII's chains to the Bastille, declaring that France now played the role of jailer rather than liberator. In cafes, Republicans mocked the ultras, muttering that the 100,000 sons of St. Louis were less crusaders than mercenaries for monarchy. Even veterans of Napoleon's wars felt unease. They had stormed fortresses before, but for the promise of a new Europe, for the dream of liberty carried in the tricolor. Now they stormed Trocadero for the sake of propping up a king despised even by his own people. The glory felt hollow. And at home, the contradictions festered. The ultras claimed victory, but France remained restless. The economy still strained, workers still suffered, and censorship still bit deep. The victory abroad did little to reconcile the divisions within. In fact, it sharpened them. Ultras exalted, liberals despaired, and Bonapartists quietly muttered that only the emperor had known how to use France's might with true purpose. Europe, meanwhile, took note. To conservative monarchs, the campaign was proof of solidarity. The alliance held firm, thrones defended thrones, revolution crushed revolution. To liberals across the continent, it was a grim reminder that their struggle was international. Spanish exiles fled to London, Paris, and Geneva, bringing with them stories of betrayal and repression. Secret societies multiplied, convinced that the monarchs would never relent unless forced. The Bourbons had won a propaganda war abroad, but at home, they had planted seeds of alienation. The sons of St. Louis had marched as crusaders, but in their wake, they left France more divided than before. Louis VIII would not live to see the full consequences. He died in 1824. His cautious reign remembered as one of compromise and fragile balancing. His brother Charles X inherited the throne. Unlike Louis, Charles had no patience for compromise, no taste for balance. He had watched the ultras grow in strength and intended to rule as their champion. The sons of St. Louis had carried the white flag to victory in Spain. Now, Charles X would try to carry it into the heart of France itself. And there, unlike Trocadero, the fortress would not fall so easily. Louis VIII had walked a tightrope, cautious and deliberate, a king who knew compromise was survival. But when he died in 1824, the crown passed to his younger brother Charles X, and with Charles' caution gave way to conviction, moderation to zeal. Where Louis had sought balance, Charles sought restoration. He did not want merely to rule, he wanted to undo. Charles had been hardened by exile. During the Revolution, he had fled France, watched from abroad as the monarchy crumbled. His brother executed, his world swept away. Those years left scars of bitterness, faith, and unyielding certainty. To him, compromise with the revolution was not prudence, it was betrayal. Where Louis VIII had tolerated the Napoleonic Code, Charles X longed for the days before 1789. Where Louis had sought a middle road, Charles dreamed of a return to absolutism. From the moment of his coronation at Reims, a ceremony steeped in medieval ritual, Charles declared his intent. Draped in ancient robes anointed with holy oil, he evoked not the memory of a modern constitutional king, but of the sacred monarchs of old. For many watching it felt less like a crowning of the present and more like an attempt to resurrect a France long buried. His policies reflected this vision. Suffrage, already narrow, was restricted further, ensuring that only the wealthiest and most conservative voices shaped the Chamber of Deputies. To the ultras, it was a victory. To liberals, a death knell for representation. Even more inflammatory was Charles's treatment of the émigrés, the nobles who had fled during the Revolution. Under his rule, they were granted massive financial compensation for lands lost and hardships endured. To ultras, it was justice repayment for suffering and loyalty. To ordinary French citizens, it was theft. Farmers who had purchased confiscated lands during the Revolution now watched the state shower gold upon those who had abandoned France. Merchants and artisans saw their taxes funneled to aristocrats who had done nothing but wait abroad. To many, it was not indemnity, but insult, a bounty paid for treason. And then there was religion. Charles X was deeply devoutly Catholic. To him, the church was not just an ally, but the very soul of France, the antidote to the poison of revolution. Schools fell increasingly under clerical control. Enlightenment thought was suppressed in favor of catechism. Universities were purged of professors deemed too liberal, too secular, too dangerous. Priests once again wielded influence over minds and morals, shaping generations in the mold of obedience. The culmination came in 1825, when Charles introduced a law-making sacrilege punishable by death. In an age where revolutions had questioned kings, toppled churches, and exalted reason, the law seemed an absurd relic. Even some ultras hesitated at its severity. But Charles pressed forward. To mock the Eucharist, to defile sacred objects, to blaspheme openly. These, in his eyes, were not just crimes against God, but crimes against France itself. The backlash was immediate. Liberals ridiculed the law pamphlets, lampooning the idea of guillotines erected for careless words. Even moderates shook their heads, muttering that France was being dragged backward into superstition. The people remembered the revolution's rallying cry, liberty from both throne and altar. Now altar and throne seemed fused again, pressing down on the nation with suffocating weight. Charles surrounded himself with allies who shared his zeal. Chief among them was his Prime Minister Joseph de Villèle en Ultra, who governed with the conviction that compromise was weakness. Together they pushed forward with policies that alienated not only liberals and Republicans, but also the rising bourgeoisie, the middle class of merchants, professionals, and industrialists who demanded a voice in politics. The bourgeoisie had flourished under Napoleon, building fortunes on trade and contracts, navigating a France where merit often mattered more than lineage. Under Charles, they felt sidelined, ignored, their aspirations smothered by clerical dogma and aristocratic privilege. These men would become some of his fiercest opponents, not with muskets, but with newspapers, pamphlets, and the growing power of public opinion. Charles believed he was restoring France to its rightful order. In reality, he was isolating himself. He alienated liberals who had once hoped for constitutional balance. He angered veterans who still honored the tricolor. He insulted the bourgeoisie who demanded recognition. Even moderates, weary of endless repression, began to mutter that the king was out of touch. The Revolution of 1789 had been born from a sense that the monarchy no longer represented the people. Now in the late 1820s, that sentiment stirred again. Workers groaned under economic hardship, wages stagnant while food prices rose. Urban poverty deepened while aristocrats feasted on compensation. Priests lectured the hungry on obedience. And in every tavern, Napoleon's name was whispered, still his ghost, a constant reminder of what France had once dared to be. Yet Charles did not bend. Where Louis VIII had compromised, Charles believed compromise was sin. He wore his inflexibility as a badge of honor, convinced that only through unwavering devotion to monarchy and faith could France be saved. But his certainty blinded him to reality. The France of 1824 was not the France of 1788. The revolution could not be undone. Napoleon's reforms could not be erased. The people could not be silenced forever. By clinging to the past, Charles ensured he would collide with the future. If Charles Hex dreamed of restoring the sacred bond between throne and altar, he did so with a fervor that startled even some of his allies. Where Louis VIII had sought to appease, Charles sought to sanctify. The church, under his reign, was not just an institution, it was the guardian of France's soul. And he would place that soul firmly back under clerical hands. Schools were among the first battlegrounds. Under Napoleon, education had been reformed into a state enterprise, lycées, producing civil servants, technical schools, producing engineers, military academies, producing officers. Knowledge had been sharpened like a sword to serve the nation. But under Charles, priests once again entered the classrooms. Catechism replaced philosophy. Latin prayers drowned out lessons in political theory. Students were taught obedience before inquiry, tradition before progress. To royalists, this was salvation. To liberals, it was regression, a deliberate attempt to roll back the Enlightenment. Universities fared no better. Professors deemed too liberal, too secular, or too sympathetic to revolutionary ideals were dismissed. Young men restless and hungry for ideas found their classrooms emptied of voices that challenged the status quo. In the cafes of Paris, students railed against the return of clerical tyranny. They devoured banned pamphlets and debated Rousseau and Voltaire by candlelight, their minds burning with the very ideas the king hoped to extinguish. Charles X's religious devotion reached its peak in 1825 with the infamous law of sacrilege. It declared that anyone who desecrated sacred objects or mocked the Eucharist could face the death penalty. In an age when railways were beginning to be laid, factories were multiplying, and scientific societies were flourishing, the notion of executing someone for blasphemy felt absurd, medieval, and profoundly dangerous. Even some ultras recoiled. Conservative deputies shifted uneasily in their seats as the law was debated. Was France really to erect scaffolds for careless words, for drunken mockery, for childish defiance? Critics derided the law as a grotesque attempt to fuse religion with state terror. Pamphlets mocked it with biting satire. Shall we guillotine the schoolboy who scribbles irreverence on a wall? Shall we hang the drunkard who stumbles out of a tavern singing against the saints? But Charles pressed forward, convinced he was defending not just faith, but France itself. For him, sacrilege was treason against God, and treason against God was treason against king and nation. The backlash was swift. Intellectuals, even moderate ones, saw the law as proof that Charles X was blind to the realities of modern France. Journalists braved censorship to lampoon the monarchy. Secret societies found new recruits among students and artisans enraged by clerical overreach. For many, the law of sacrilege crystallized the sense that the monarchy was dragging France backward into chains of superstition and repression. Meanwhile, the social climate worsened. Economic hardship deepened resentment. Grain prices fluctuated, workers in Paris and Lyon struggled with low wages, and artisans feared the encroachment of industrial machines. Hunger sharpened discontent, and sermons promising salvation in the next world did little to comfort stomachs empty in this one. The clergy, growing richer and more powerful under royal favor, became lightning rods for public anger. Priests walking through city streets were mocked or pelted with stones, symbols of a system many saw as parasitic. In villages, the picture was complex. Some peasants, devout and weary of revolution's chaos, welcomed the church's return. They knelt at restored altars, grateful for stability comforted by rituals that had survived centuries. But in cities where liberalism thrived, where workers crowded into slums, where the memory of 1789 was strongest, the church's growing grip felt like a chain on progress. Resistance took many forms. In print pamphlets and clandestine newspapers railed against clerical dominance. In universities, professors skirted censorship with coded lectures, planting seeds of skepticism in eager minds. In taverns, songs mocking priests spread from table to table, choruses of satire louder than sermons. Even within Parliament, opposition grew. Liberals denounced the blasphemy law, the émigré indemnities, and the suffocating presence of the church in public life. By the late 1820s, France had become a country of two faiths, not Catholicism and Protestantism, but faith in the old order and faith in the revolution. Charles VI stood firmly with the first, cloaked in divine conviction. But the second faith, faith in liberty, reason, and progress, was rising like a tide he could neither bless nor banish. And the tide was not only intellectual, it was political. In the 1827 elections, Charles's government faced a stunning rebuke. Liberal candidates surged, gaining significant ground in the Chamber of Deputies. The victory was celebrated in Paris with fireworks and tricolor flags defiantly displayed. Crowds filled the streets, cheering not only the candidates, but the idea that France could still resist. Charles, however, did not waver. He dismissed his Prime Minister Joseph de Villèle, but doubled down on his convictions. To him, the growing liberal opposition was not the will of the people, but a conspiracy proof that the revolution's poison lingered. He believed that divine right would triumph where politics faltered. But France had changed too much to bow forever. Students still carried Rousseau in their satchels. Workers still sang of liberty. Veterans still remembered Napoleon's eagle. Merchants and lawyers, the new bourgeoisie, demanded a voice commensurate with their growing power. And all of them looked at Charles X's policies and saw not salvation, but suffocation. Religion intended by the king to bind France together had instead become the wedge that drove it apart. His devotion, sincere though it was, blinded him to the reality that faith could not replace freedom nor alter substitute for bread. The seeds of revolution were being sown again, watered by censorship, nourished by poverty, fertilized by clerical arrogance. They sprouted in classrooms and cafes and workshops in the restless imagination of a nation that had once toppled a king and might yet topple another. And Charles X, cloaked in certainty, continued to march toward the storm. By the late 1820s, the cracks in Charles X's kingdom were no longer hidden. They were chasms. His devotion to throne and altar had alienated liberals, his indemnities to émigrés had enraged the middle class, and his blasphemy laws had turned even moderates against him. France was restless, muttering in cafes, shouting in newspapers, whispering in classrooms. The king's response was not to listen, but to double down. In 1829, Charles appointed a new prime minister, Jules de Polignac, an ultra of the deepest dye. Polignac was a man of piety and aristocratic pride, convinced, like the king, that monarchy was sacred and liberalism a disease. To Charles, he was the perfect ally. To liberals, he was the final straw. The Chamber of Deputies, emboldened by its liberal victories in recent elections, despised him. Petitions poured in denouncing the ministry, demanding his resignation. But Charles ignored them all. The tension escalated into open confrontation in early 1830. The Chamber of Deputies, dominated by liberal and moderate voices, issued a bold address of the 221. In this manifesto, they declared they no longer had confidence in the king's government. It was in effect a vote of no confidence in Charles himself. The message was clear: either Polignac must go or the monarchy would face crisis. Charles's reaction was defiance. He dissolved the chamber. If the deputies would not submit, he would call new elections. Confident that the people would support him, he prepared for victory. But when the ballots were counted in July, the results were disastrous. Liberals gained even more seats. The people had spoken, and they had chosen liberty. For any cautious monarch, this would have been the moment to compromise. But Charles X was no Louis VIII. He saw the elections not as a verdict, but as a conspiracy. In his mind, the revolution of 1789 was returning under the guise of parliamentary opposition. And if France was slipping into rebellion, then only decisive authority could save her. On July 25, 1830, Charles issued the infamous July Ordinances, 4 decrees that shattered the fragile veneer of constitutional monarchy. First, he suspended freedom of the press, silencing the newspapers that had become the lifeblood of liberal opposition. Second, he dissolved the newly elected Chamber of Deputies before it had even convened. Third, he rewrote electoral laws to restrict suffrage even further, effectively disenfranchising much of the bourgeoisie. Fourth, he called for new elections under these suffocating rules. The ordinances were a thunderclap. In one stroke, Charles had dismantled the rights his brother had reluctantly granted in 1814. The Constitution was broken, the Charter betrayed. To liberals, it was nothing less than a coup d'etat by the king himself. The reaction was immediate. In Paris, journalists refused to comply. Editors gathered at the office of the newspaper Le National declaring that the ordinances were illegal, unconstitutional, and void. They printed defiant headlines even as police raided presses and seized papers. One editor wrote, "The charter has been violated. The monarchy has broken its contract with the nation. The regime has committed suicide." Crowds poured into the streets. Workers, students, and veterans rallied together. Their grievances suddenly fused into a single cry: the king had abandoned the Constitution, and with it his legitimacy. In taverns, men slammed fists onto tables and shouted that France had been betrayed. In workshops, apprentices refused orders, muttering of barricades. Economic hardship added fuel to the fire. The late 1820s had brought harvest failures, rising bread prices, and growing unemployment. Hungry bellies are fertile soil for revolution, and in Paris, hunger turned discontent into fury. The ordinances were not abstract politics. They were an assault on survival, dignity, and hope. In the streets, anger took form. Tricolor flags, long banned by the Bourbons, reappeared unfurled from windows and carried by crowds. Songs of the Revolution and the Empire, suppressed for years, echoed again in public squares. Posters denouncing Charles plastered the walls, some scrawled with only 2 words, "À bas le roi," down with the king. Charles, ensconced in his palace at St. Cloud, seemed blind to the danger. He believed the army would restore order, that the people would tire, that authority once asserted could not be resisted. But Paris was not the same city it had been in 1815. Its people had lived through monarchy, revolution, empire, and restoration. They had learned that kings could fall, that barricades could rise, that the streets could decide history. On July 27th, only 2 days after the ordinances were issued, the first barricades went up. Paris was about to ignite. The crisis of 1830 had begun not with musket fire, but with ink hunger and arrogance. Charles had gambled that he could smother liberty with decrees. Instead, he had struck the match that would set France ablaze. Paris had seen revolutions before, but in July of 1830, it was not the voice of deputies or the decrees of kings that decided the future. It was the voice of the streets. On the morning of July 27th, news of Charles X's ordinances spread like lightning. Printers, journalists, and students were the first to act. When royal police arrived to shut down presses, workers simply refused. Type was hidden and sellers' ink smuggled through alleys, newspapers printed in secret. The words of defiance that Charles had tried to silence now multiplied faster than ever. Crowds gathered outside shuttered presses, their anger swelling with each confiscated page. Students marched arm in arm, waving banned tricolor flags. The slogans were familiar, but they burned with new fire: "Vive la Charte" and "À bas les Bourbons." By midday, stones flew at soldiers' muskets, cracked in alleys, and barricades began to rise. The first night was chaos. Shots rang out across narrow streets. Windows rattled with the roar of gunfire. By dawn, Paris had become a city at war with itself. The cobblestones of the Latin Quarter were ripped up to build defenses, carts, overturned trees felled to block the paths of cavalry. The barricade born in the Revolution of 1789, and, immortalized under Napoleon, returned as the people's weapon. Yay. On July 28th, the fighting spread. Students, artisans, and workers armed with hunting rifles, sabers, and even kitchen knives confronted professional soldiers. Yet the army, though disciplined, was demoralized. Many soldiers were conscripts reluctant to fire on their countrymen. Some refused orders outright. Others defected, slipping across barricades to join the rebels. The tricolor long outlawed now flew boldly over Paris. It was raised atop the Hôtel de Ville, draped across barricades pinned to jackets. Each flutter of blue, white, and red was defiance incarnate, a reminder that the revolution's ideals could not be buried under lilies and censored by ordinances. By July 29th, the city was transformed. Smoke rose from burning guardhouses. Streets echoed with La Marseillaise. Women carried food and ammunition to fighters. Children darted through alleys delivering messages between barricades. Paris was not merely resisting, it was revolting. Royal troops commanded by Marshal Marmont struggled to regain control. He ordered cannon fire into crowded streets, but every volley only deepened resistance. Barricades grew higher, muskets more plentiful, determination more fierce. Paris was no longer just protesting decrees, it was overthrowing a king. Inside the royal palace at Saint-Cloud, Charles V remained obstinate. Advisors begged him to withdraw the ordinances, to compromise to save his crown. He refused. To Charles' retreat meant surrender not just of power, but of principle. He saw himself as defender of monarchy ordained by God, incapable of yielding to mobs. But Paris cared nothing for divine right. It cared for bread, liberty, and dignity. On July 30th, the balance tipped. Government troops faltered, desertions mounted, and entire regiments refused to fire. The tricolor flew from Notre Dame itself, a symbol as potent as any battlefield victory. Crowds surged through the streets chanting, "Down with the king, long live liberty." On July 31st, after 3 days of barricade, smoke, and blood, the 3 glorious days reached their climax. Charles X, realizing his position was hopeless, abdicated. But even in abdication, he clung to illusion. He attempted to pass the crown to his grandson, Henri, Duke of Bordeaux. Yet the people would not accept another Bourbon child as monarch. The dynasty itself was finished. As Charles fled Paris under guard, slipping toward exile, the capital celebrated. Bells rang, crowds embraced tricolors, waved from every rooftop. Paris had once again written history with its own hands. But victory raised questions. Who would rule? Would France be a republic once more, as in 1792? Would it crown a new emperor in the image of Napoleon? Or would it accept another monarch, one palatable enough to liberals but weak enough to appease conservatives? The answer came swiftly. Deputies in the chamber turned not to radicals or Bonapartists, but to a compromise. Louis-Philippe, Duke of Orleans, cousin of Charles IX. Known as the Citizen King, he had sympathies with the revolution, a reputation for moderation and the pragmatism the moment demanded. On August 9, 1830, Louis-Philippe was declared King of the French, a subtle but profound change. He was not King of France as though the land and people were possessions, but King of the French, a monarch defined by his nation. Yet beneath the celebrations lay unease. The July Revolution had toppled a king, but it had not ended the cycle of upheaval. Barricades had won liberty again, but how long would liberty survive under another crown? The Bourbons had fallen, but the shadow of the revolution and the ghost of Napoleon still haunted every cheer. Paris had triumphed in 3 days, but France's struggle was not over. It had only entered its next act. The white lilies of the Bourbons had fallen. In their place, the tricolor once more rippled across Paris, not as rebellion, but as the flag of government itself. Into this moment stepped Louis-Philippe, Duke of Orleans, proclaimed not King of France, but King of the French. The change of title was deliberate, a nod to sovereignty flowing from the people rather than from divine right. He was styled the Citizen King, a monarch meant to bridge the gulf between throne and nation. At first, it seemed as though France had found its answer. Louis-Philippe walked the streets in a plain frock coat, eschewing the jeweled robes of his predecessors. He dined simply mingled with crowds and presented himself not as a distant sovereign, but as one of them, a man shaped by revolution, cautious of absolutism, eager to reconcile monarchy with liberty. For weary citizens, it was a refreshing contrast to Charles X's arrogance. His early policies reflected this spirit. He accepted the charter as the foundation of his rule, expanded press freedoms, and promised a government responsive to the nation. Paris exhaled with relief. In the Palace of Versailles, once a symbol of Bourbon excess, Louis-Philippe ordered the creation of a museum dedicated to all the glories of France. On its walls, portraits of kings hung beside those of republicans and emperors. History, fractured and contested, was now woven together under one roof, a gesture of unity. But the most dramatic symbol came in 1840. After long negotiations with Britain, Napoleon's ashes, kept since his death in 1821 on St. Helena, were returned to France. The funeral cortege wound through the streets of Paris, followed by throngs of mourners, veterans, and curious citizens. When the coffin was placed in its resting place at Les Invalides, beneath a gilded dome, Napoleon was no longer an exile or a prisoner. He was France's hero, claimed by the state itself. For Louis-Philippe, it was a masterstroke. By embracing Napoleon's memory, he sought to bind together monarchists, liberals, and Bonapartists under a single banner of national pride. And for a time, it worked. The citizen king presided over a France that seemed at last stable. Industry expanded, railways spread, and the middle class flourished. The July monarchy was not revolutionary, but it was modern. To merchants, bankers, and factory owners, it felt like progress. Yet beneath the surface, discontent brewed. Louis-Philippe had risen on the shoulders of workers and students who fought on the barricades in 1830. But once enthroned, he turned his back on them. Voting rights remained restricted to a tiny fraction of wealthy men. Workers, artisans, and peasants found their cries for representation ignored. The citizen king walked in plain clothes, but his government served the bourgeoisie more than the common people. For the poor, promises of liberty soured into disillusionment. Bread remained expensive, wages, stagnant conditions harsh. Strikes were met with repression, protests with soldiers. When workers gathered in Paris to demand relief, they found bayonets instead of answers. For them, the July monarchy was not the people's crown, but a bourgeois mask for aristocracy. Republicans too remained restless. They saw Louis-Philippe not as a reconciler, but as an obstacle to true liberty. They remembered the tricolor of 1792, the Republic of Citizens equal before the law, and resented the compromises of monarchy. Secret societies revived plotting once more in cellars and attics, convinced the July monarchy was merely another chapter in the long struggle toward a republic. And then there were the Bonapartists. Napoleon's ashes had been returned, but his legacy was not so easily contained. To many, the Bonaparte name still conjured dreams of order, glory, and national strength. Louis-Philippe could display the emperor's coffin, but he could not claim his aura. In villages and towns, whispers grew again another Napoleon might yet rise. By the 1840s, these tensions converged. The middle class demanded further political reform. Workers demanded relief and dignity. Republicans demanded a republic. Bonapartists demanded a name. The July monarchy, intended as a compromise, instead became a lightning rod for dissatisfaction. In 1848, crisis erupted. Economic downturn brought unemployment and hunger to the cities. Demonstrations filled Paris demanding electoral reform. When the king's government responded with repression, the protests swelled into revolution. Barricades rose again, echoing those of 1830. Crowds surged, chanting not for Louis-Philippe, but against him. This time, the king did not fight. Dressed in his plain black coat, Louis-Philippe abdicated and fled into exile in England. The citizen king who had promised to reconcile monarchy with liberty was gone, his crown toppled by the very people who had once raised him up. In his place, a second republic was declared. And within 4 years, that republic would choose as its president, not a Bourbon, not an Orleans, but a Bonaparte Louis Napoleon nephew of the emperor. The ghost of Napoleon, carried through decades of exile and legend, had become flesh again. The cycle was complete. France since 1789 had toppled kings, crowned emperors, raised republics, restored monarchs, and built barricades again and again. Each time it sought to reconcile liberty with order past, with future monarchy with revolution, and each time it failed. For even after Waterloo, after St. Helena, after white flags and barricades, Napoleon's shadow lingered. He had been more than a man, he was an idea. And ideas, unlike men, cannot be exiled. They haunt, inspire, and return when least expected. France, after Napoleon, was never truly free of him. Whether in defiance of Bourbons and the tricolor over barricades, or in the ashes brought home to Paris, his presence endured. Kings rose and fell, but the legend of the emperor remained shaping destinies long after his death. And so, the story of France in the 19th century is not only the story of kings and revolutions, it is the story of a nation trying and failing to escape the shadow of the man who had once crowned himself emperor, who had promised glory, and who had left behind a legacy too vast to be buried.